Well, hello and welcome to another video. The last video I did was at the church. Now I'm supposed to be working at home a little bit more if I can. And so here we are. I shared with you last time 4 biblical principles for dealing with the time we're in with a pandemic and our struggles with all of the different regulations that we're never really quite sure how to respond to. And I can tell you from my own response, but also from response I've gotten, that the first principle is the most difficult. And I've been thinking about the first principle since then. And the first principle I gave you was from Romans, and the instruction to submit to the governing authorities and just follow the guidelines, whether I agree with them or don't agree with them. God's word is to submit to that and follow them. And I can tell you that that's a real struggle for me. I don't find that easy at all. And I had to work through my own heart and my own mind with God for quite a while before I was able to make that video, because I wasn't sure I could be following my own advice. And so I want to share a little bit more on that principle. I think it's worthwhile to think further. And again, this is not going to be the last word either, but it's just a few more things I've been thinking about since I made that other video. And the first thing I want to talk about is I think one of the reasons we find this idea of submitting in any context, but maybe particularly to governing authorities, so difficult, so challenging. And I think one of the reasons is not biblical, it's just cultural and linguistic, in fact. I think that we live in a situation where there are 2 words that seem to be similar and are often used as synonyms of each other, but in fact have very different meanings. And those 2 words are subjection and submission. They sound the same, and we sometimes use them interchangeably, but we shouldn't. Or sometimes when we hear submission, in our minds and in our emotional response, we think subjection. So let me just clarify that a little bit, because I don't think the Bible is anywhere telling us to be subjected by governments or in any context. And the difference, of course, is subjection involves force. If I force you to do my will against your will, but I forced you to do it anyway, then you're under my subjection. The Bible doesn't call us to that. It calls us to submission. Submission is always voluntary. We choose to do it. We choose to submit. Now that becomes complicated when those in authority, and I don't just mean governments, but even in relationships and in work environments and so on, when those in authority over us try to subject us to something, but we want to be submissive, as the scriptures tell us. And I think this is not a trivial concept. We need to, if we want to be followers of Jesus Christ, I believe we need to carefully and diligently and consistently over a long time wrestle with this issue. Because I can tell you, as a pastor, that submission is almost always at the source of the problems that people come for counseling on, whether it's a marriage relationship or a family relationship or a work relationship or a church conflict. Almost always at the root of the issue is submission. In Ephesians, we're told to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, and no one's exempt from that. That instruction is given to all of us to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So in relationship to this idea of governing authorities and submission to them from Romans, I want to visit 2 biblical stories to get some further food for thought. Again, this isn't final conclusions, but it just gives you some more things to meditate on, things to work with, things to think through. And the first one is in 2 Kings chapter 5, and it's the story of Naaman. It's a fascinating story, and I'll just remind you of some of the details, though more of the details are there in 2 Kings. You can read them for yourself. But the general idea is this. There's a foreign general. He's not part of the Israelites. He's not a descendant of Abraham. He's a foreigner. And he's a high-ranking general in the kingdom where he lives. And it seems he might even be the commander of the army, a close friend of the king. And this general has leprosy. And so through a series of events, he ends up coming to the prophet Elijah seeking healing from his leprosy. And he brings with him an entourage, and he brings with him very extensive riches to pay for this service of being healed. And when he arrives at the prophet's door, the prophet doesn't even give him the time of day. The prophet just sends out a servant, and the servant says to Naaman, "My master the prophet says, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River and you'll be healed." Well, Naaman takes great offense at this. I mean, he's an important person. The prophet won't even come up to see him. The prophet won't receive any of his gifts or payments. It's just he doesn't know how to handle this situation. And he goes off in a storm, in a huff, in an anger, and there's no way he's going to do that. I mean, the Jordan's dirty. He's not going to dirty himself in the Jordan River. He has far cleaner and better rivers back home that he could wash in. And as they travel away, one of Naaman's entourage talks to him and says, "You know, if the prophet had asked you to do mighty things, would you not have done them?" And Naaman says, "Yes, I would have done anything, any great thing, heroic thing." And so his friend or the other person there says, "Well, what's the harm then in doing this? I mean, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Just go on. No one needs to know. If it works, you'll be healed. Why not give it a try? The Jordan River's right here. Just do it." And so Naaman agrees, and he becomes submissive to God's instruction through the prophet. He goes down to the Jordan River. He dunks himself 7 times, and his skin is as clear as a boy's, just absolutely healed. And Naaman says in that moment, "There is only one true God, and it is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will worship no other God from this day forward. I've been transformed." And then he goes back to the prophet. Again, the prophet doesn't accept any payment. He does accept some thanks, but he has a question. The reason he goes back to the prophet is he has a question he needs to ask, and it's exactly the same question you and I have when we face restrictions to like church attendance and stuff in our time. And so he goes back to the prophet, and this time the prophet comes out to him and they talk. And his question is this: when I go home, my master, the king, is going to require of me that I assist him in going to the temple of the false god. And when I get there, I'll be assisting him. He'll be on my shoulder. I'll be helping him along. And when the king wants to bow before this false god, I have to physically bow as well because of the situation. What should I do now that I only worship the true God? The prophet's answer is very brief and gives some room to think about things, but he says, "Go in peace." And I take that to mean, Naaman, it's okay. The governing authority over you is requiring you to do something. God knows that you're not actually worshiping that false god, so be submissive to the governing authority and assist him in that way. And so Naaman goes, and that's what he does. Now, when I think through that story in the context of being submissive to governing authorities, I immediately think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were required by King Nebuchadnezzar to bow before an idol, and they refused to. But let's look at the context, and I want to read you a letter that was written from God to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. Well, it wasn't actually written specifically to them, but it was written by Jeremiah, who was still back in Jerusalem that had been destroyed. And he's writing now as the prophet of God to those who'd been carried away into slavery, in chains, in exile to Babylon. And he's been asked, well, what do we do? How do we live in this situation? And here's what God says to the people that Jeremiah is writing to them. And these people include Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In Jeremiah chapter 29, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all of those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." I get tripped up on that first sentence because We know the story. The story is Babylon surrounded Jerusalem and put them under siege, and things got so bad inside Jerusalem that the people actually were driven to cannibalism to try to survive it. I mean, you can't imagine a more horrific situation than Babylon had just put these people through. And then after doing that, they leveled the walls of Jerusalem. They leveled the city. They went into the temple of God and desecrated it, and they took out all the treasures back to Babylon. And then they put these people, the higher class people from Jerusalem, into chains and dragged them off to Babylon to serve them as their servants and as their slaves. Horrific. And yet in this situation, God says, I carried you into exile. It wasn't the Babylonians who did it. If I had not given my word or given my blessing, as it were, they were the hand of God. So what does God say then? How should they live in this situation? Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Can you imagine that? Carried off under duress after being defeated in a terrible siege. And God's advice is this: in the situation you find yourself, under the authority of a foreign god, a foreign nation, live the best life you can, given the circumstances you're under. Live the best life you can under those circumstances. And not only that, seek the good of the city you've been resettled into and pray for those who are over you. Sounds exactly like what Paul says to us in Romans. Pray for the prosperity of those who have just dragged you into exile. Pray for their good, not their harm. And then he goes on with some more advice, because this isn't the only advice they're getting. He says this: yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. So there's a warning in this letter from Jeremiah to the exiles. And the warning is there's all kinds of people who are willing to tell you what your tickling ears want to hear. It says dreams that you have given them. So the prophets, the so-called prophets, are listening to what the people want to hear, and then they're giving them that advice. And it's not the same as Jeremiah's advice. It's the opposite. Rebel, do badly, seek revenge, and all of that kind of stuff. And Jeremiah is saying, no, that's not God's message. God's message is live at peace. Do whatever you can to live your best possible life in a difficult circumstance. And even pray for your captors. This is what it means to be submissive to governing authorities. In Romans, it's just straight up, be submissive to governing authorities. Here we're given the layout of the land, of what it looks like, what that means in greater detail. Commentary on that idea. And then he goes on with these promises. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. God has not abandoned you. Now, in that context, we need to read Daniel, because in Daniel, we find that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and Daniel, all of them, they live in line with this letter from Jeremiah. Their entire attitude towards their life in captivity is to prosper themselves, but also prosper their masters. They do the best they can. Now, they find ways to get around so that they can live by the law of God, live the best life they can in submission to God, but also in submission to the authorities. And they do come to places where the line seems to be crossed, and they refuse to bow to that idol. And I think the difference there is in Naaman's case, he's not bowing, but he's just assisting the king. In Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's case, they're on their own, and so that's a different thing. And there's room to do a lot of conversation and thinking about that, which I'm not going to get into the details here. But you can tell as you read the book of Daniel that the overall attitude is in line with Jeremiah's teaching here in this regard, and it comes down to that statement at the beginning, that shocking statement at the beginning. I carried you into exile. It wasn't the Babylonians. It's not their fault. I did it, God says. God takes responsibility for the situation we are in. And so this brings us really back to the first garden in terms of submission, because the issue remains the same. Do we believe God when he says what's best for us? Or do we think we're wiser than God and that we know what's right and what's wrong? That's what it comes down to. By submitting to the governing authorities, we are submitting to God. God has brought about the situation we're in, whether we like it or not. They certainly didn't like being in exile, slaves in exile after such horrific suffering. But God's advice to them, I think, is the same to this day. Live the best life you can in service to God under the conditions you find yourself. Be submissive to the governing authorities and pray for them. Pray for their well-being, that they will prosper, that they would do well, because then you will do well too. God knows what's good. God knows the plans he has for us. That's what he says here in the end. I have plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Do you trust me? The situation you're in right now is for your good. It's in line with my plans. If you listen to me and seek me with all your heart, you will live in to what God has in store, what God is preparing you for right now. And so I leave you with this thought to consider when we think about submission. You cannot be forced to do what you have chosen to do. I cannot be forced to do what I have chosen to do. It's worth pondering.